Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The nominee for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States says China will remain the primary challenge to the U.S. military for as long as a century. Now, this echoes a warning that had been brought out by the Pentagon back in 2018 as well, saying essentially that China and Russia are bigger threats to the U.S. than even terrorism. Is that true? Or is this an overstatement and simply a disagreement on the fact that China is rising, its power and influence, of course, across the world rising, not just politically, but militarily as well. And of course, economically, I may add. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Moundir Sajjad Bechari, who is a geopolitician, and China expert. He's joining us now from Paris. We're also joined by Manuel Modoni, who is an Asia-Pacific analyst. He's joining us now from Rome. And we're also joined by Richard Turcsanyi, who is an East Asia expert. He's a program director at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies. He is joining us now from Olomouc in the Czech Republic. Richard, Manuel, and Moundir, thank you all for joining us. Moundir, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of this Joint Chiefs of Staff, this nominee for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his warning? Why is China being seen as a threat to the U.S.?
Yes, well, we have to really, let's say, qualify what is threat from an American perspective. I think it's not really a threat. It's more about frustration towards a new player in the international arena that, yes, does threaten American hegemony in Asia, first of all, but more in a most subtle way, how China could eventually propose and offer an alternative, let's say, model of so-called development. Therefore, there's this very, how to say, as I said, frustration, but also uncertainty from an administration that tries to, while removing itself from military, let's say, involvement, try to remodel a much more offensive trade, commercial way as opposed to what China is trying to do today.
Manuel, you know, it's interesting. Part of what General Milley there said at his nomination hearing was that China has learned the examples from U.S. wars, for example, in the Middle East, and is trying to do better, as using those wars as a lesson on how to better its military and how to move forward militarily as well. Why would that be a bad thing? Isn't that natural that any country would look at another's military experience and try to better themselves?
Yes, I think so. I do believe that China for now is not a threat to the US, but a security competitor. I mean, China is rising. There is an interesting book of Professor Graham Allison, Destined for War, about the possibility for China and America to escape the Thucydides trap. You know, when you have an emerging power like China and a dominant power like the US, always the emerging power tries to topple down the dominant power. Now, I do believe that the main problem is in the maritime security, because obviously the Popular Liberation Army is still far from achieving a parity with the US Army. But if we consider the main area of a potential conflict, such as East Asia Sea and especially the South China Sea and the cross-strait relations between Taiwan and mainland China, well, then we see that the problems here are for maritime power, and the Popular Liberation Army Navy is catching up with America. Also, there is a report from RAND I think they made it in 2015 about the 9 areas of strategic parity that China is trying to achieve, and they will not achieve it soon. But China is very strong in the coastal defenses, and there is some kind of arm competition. Also, I do believe that Trump some days ago announced that they will sell more arms to Taiwan. And so this is fostering competition and tension in the strait.
Okay, so then, Richard, I want to get your thoughts on that because, all of the above sounds very natural, doesn't it, in a multilateral world, in a multipolar world, I should say, pardon me, where globalization, et cetera, is taking place, that the U.S. would not always just be the dominant power across the world. Do you think it's actually just the U.S. having a hard time accepting that fact?
Thank you for having me. Yes, to some extent, I would agree with what you suggested. The US strategic culture and some kind of institutional memory doesn't go, centuries backwards. And for Americans, it seems very natural that they are the number one, that they are the hegemonic power, and they believe that the stable and prosperous world is basically a result of this. Especially from Chinese perspective and also the perspective which you suggested, obviously, if we look at it theoretically or from longer historical perspective, that's just the case in perhaps last century. As you said, and as my other discussant also said, with growing China, it is natural that there is growing competition. It is natural that perhaps the US will not be as dominant, that there will be more Chinese presence, or if you will, Chinese influence all over the world, and also that American military predominance will not be as it used to be for decades previously.
So, Moundir, all of this goes back to one of the issues, and that is, of course, of globalization as a whole, isn't it? Because to all of us, globalization, free markets, et cetera, were sold as a good thing, right? Where competition is a good thing as well. So then for General Milley to be sitting there in the U.S. Senate hearing for his nomination and be talking about China as a competitor, and for the Pentagon last year to call China and even Russia a bigger threat than even terrorism because of global or great power competition, does that make sense from the Western point of view? Because they're the very ones who have told us competition is a good thing.
Yes. Well, again, we have to pinpoint the meaning of what is competition as being enemy. I do have to say that, again, we have to reassess this notion from a very Western-centric point of view, seeing a new great power rising that does not necessarily use the same institutions, the same, rules and channels that the first world has been applying for over 2 centuries. Therefore, it's not just about competition, it's not about rivalry. I do think that they do see China to a certain extent as an enemy, in a sense that enemy brings this idea of hostility. Of course, what the new nominee in the US was saying, no, we are not enemy because enemy means to be at war. But we are in 2019. There will never be war today in the traditional sense of meaning because of the nuclear deterrence, because of history lesson, generally speaking. But there is a strong idea of enemy from a trade perspective, where this new hostility and measure that US has been applying on Huawei, on the steels market and so on. How can we still consider this as, this is just rival, this is just competition, this is a healthy competition? No, it is not, because it is affecting every single blockchain suppliers in our international system. Therefore, to just perceive this as a new way to globalize ourselves and we have to put measure for globalization. Well, if you put measure for globalization, then those measure has to be universal, has to be neutral, and has to be beneficial for every single partner of the chain.
That's a very good point. Manuel, I want thoughts on that because, again, as I'd put it, Moundir, this was the very idea sold to us by the West that competition is a good thing. Is it a bad thing when it comes to China? Is it a bad thing when Chinese tech companies such as Huawei do better, have more sales around the world than even Apple, that they're the first ones to come out with 5G, for example, et cetera?
Well, I do believe it depends on the point of view. I mean, China is becoming more powerful in geoeconomics, so in the use of economic measures to make the threats that President Trump is making with the trade war. So I do believe that for now, China's raising will be peaceful and also that there will not be a threat in economic and military way. But on the other hand, China has some economic power, especially towards Southeast Asian states and ASEAN states, and also towards Japan and South Korea. So whenever it comes to a crisis like the one between China and the US, they can always use some economic sanctions like embargo of rare minerals or like embargo on some fruits or products from other states. And so I do believe that it should be treated carefully.
Richard, I wonder what you make of it, because, you know, sitting in Europe, I imagine that European countries are quite nervous about the current trade war, tech war, and the sort of competition that's occurring right now amongst this trade war as well, considering it means access to 5G, et cetera, is being put under pressure by the U.S. administration.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the whole issue of like what is the nature of Chinese steps. You know, we often hear that they are illegal, illegitimate, or against American interest. Now, a lot of what we are talking about of China catching up with the US, we may safely accept that may be really against American interest. And as much as it is legitimate thing for China to try to catch up with the US, it is also legitimate for the US to try to basically compete. Now, with Huawei, with 5G, that seems to be really a big premium on which country, which companies will secure the whole thing. And there are obvious security issues. There are obvious issues when it comes to economic interest. The US is obviously trying to be the dominant player over there. And looking at it from European perspective, for many European countries, basically, they have to answer for themselves what is in their interest as well, whether the risks which being suggested are linked to Huawei, to Chinese technology, should be considered, or whether they should go along with the Chinese companies because, for instance, that can give them, that can save them some economic resources and so on, or they should prefer the interest of having good bilateral relations with the US. I mean, there are a lot of, essentially, this is about political decisions.
Indeed. And that's a good point to end on. We're going to end off this segment on that point. But of course, we appreciate all of our guests for their time and their insight. We were joined there by Richard, Manuel, and Moundir, sharing their thoughts with us on this important topic. And one of the things that I want to hone in on is, yes, that this is a lot about politics, isn't it? It's not actually about military power necessarily, though, of course, this is all a part of that also under that umbrella. But as Mehdi there said, China is not the enemy, I'm quoting him, but is a competitor. This is pretty much echoing what was last year said by the then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who had said great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security. Essentially, at least in my opinion, all of this means that in the U.S. point of view now, competition is not necessarily a good thing for U.S. interests, even though, as I'd put to our guests, they are the ones who sold competition to the rest of us around the world as a good thing. So why do they have a problem with China? Why do they have a problem with Russia even rising and now taking part in a multipolar world? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss an interesting Pew poll, Pew Research Center poll, I should say, which has come out. And it says that nearly 18 years since the start of the war in Afghanistan and 16 years since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a majority of U.S. military veterans say both those wars were not worth fighting. And that's actually echoed and paralleled by the public's point of view on both of those wars as well. And I would add, any involvement in Syria is also seen in quite a negative light by both military veterans as well as the public as well. Though, as always, in a divided America, there is a very, very prominent partisan divide on all of these issues, with Republicans largely more in favor of these wars versus those who would identify as Democrats or even independents. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Mohammad Hussein, who is Policy Director at the Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research. He's joining us now from Suleimania on the line. We're joined by Bola, who is a Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of the West of England. He's joining us now from Bristol. And we're also joined by Mark Sloboda, who is a U.S. Navy vet, and he's a Senior Lecturer in International Relations and Security Studies. He's joining us now from Moscow in Russia. Mark, Bola, and Mohammed, thank you all for joining us. Mark, I'd like to start with you. What are your thoughts about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as, of course, any U.S. involvement in Syria?
Well, I mean, speaking as a military veteran myself, I'm very strongly against these wars across the Middle East and North Africa. They are wars of regime change, but more than that, they are wars of hegemony of the U.S. across the Middle East. And U.S. military veterans signed up to defend their country from threats, not to serve as the foreign legions of American empire across the world. And I think growing parts of the public are starting to really grow weary of what multiple U.S. Democratic presidential candidates are now calling the forever wars. And foremost among them is Tulsi Gabbard, who herself is also a combat veteran from Iraq. So I think the most striking thing about these polls is how close they are to general public opinion, with majorities for all of these being against the war, both veterans, both the general public. Yeah. And this didn't change according to military experience or rank, and also the big partisan divide. It shows how strong this political identification is, even among the military, with Republicans by a nearly 3-to-1 margin over Democrats, showing more support for these wars, and the Democrats less.
Okay, so Bola, we were all told that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were to not only make America safer, but the world safer. Do you think that has occurred?
Absolutely not. I think one of the very unfortunate footnotes to these wars are the civilian casualties from these three countries, from Iraq, Afghanistan, and also Pakistan, the kind of illegal drone warfare that is going on in Pakistan, and the thousands and thousands of people, innocent civilians, that have been caught in the crossfires and have died as a result. I think it's often the case that when we make this analysis about the cost and benefit of those wars, and we come up with these grandiose ideas about the need to fight terrorism, that we lose sight of the very significant part of those who have been caught in the crossfires innocently and have died. And I don't think that there is any sense in which we could justify at all, in any way, the over 200,000 people who have died in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in the war on terror in Pakistan. And there is no justification for it whatsoever.
Okay. Mohammed, I wanted to get your thoughts, because you're sitting in Iraq. Do you believe that the U.S. invasion of Iraq was a good thing for your country? Because, the argument many times, Mohammed, is that, listen, the overthrow of Saddam was certainly a good thing because he was a human rights violator, et cetera, et cetera. But then the ensuing insecurity and terrorism that resulted because of that invasion, I should say, has certainly not been a good thing, has it?
Well, looking back to what happened in 2003, I would say, like, the majority of Iraqi people who supported the U.S. invasion in 2003 now are regretted, and now they believe that what the aftermath of the U.S. invasion and the political process that follows the invasion went very wrong, and it made the U.S. forces and the U.S. administration, as well as their Iraqi allies, mess up with too many crises and problems, and that's what we saw, like in 2014 until 2018. We end up with ISIS war and too many insurgent groups and terror organizations in Iraq and even like a neighboring country like Syria.
Yeah.
So I would say like that the majority of people in Iraq nowadays, it happened in 2003 and the U.S. invasion in 2003 actually deteriorated the political, security, and economic situations in Iraq, and it badly affected like almost everyone in Iraq. And you know, it cost us like hundreds of thousands lives. It cost us like billions of dollars and just like go wasted with corrupt deals and with the reconstruction projects that served nothing. I mean, it's hard to find any Iraqi citizen look at the 2003 invasion from a positive perspective.
Okay, so Mark, I'm wondering then, if we bring it to contemporary times then, do you think that the U.S. military, the U.S. establishment has learned the lessons from those wars? That, listen, they went into it clearly with bad planning, bad intelligence, as we well know, and we can all remember Colin Powell at the UN Security Council selling the war in Iraq with information which was clearly all a lie. Do you think that we're just seeing history repeat itself over and over again with this now escalation in this region towards Iran?
I think that the U.S. military, the Pentagon, has learned a very important lesson from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's that these wars are extremely profitable, that these wars are very easy to convince Congress to shower them with money for arms. It's very profitable for the military-industrial complex in the United States. And we all know there's a revolving door between the Pentagon brass and these military-industrial companies. So it's profitable for the military-industrial companies. It's profitable for the Pentagon. They get as much spending as they want. And it also gives the U.S. military a lot of basic free experience, because a military is only good as its combat experience. This gives the U.S. military is the most experienced military on the planet, fighting a constant low-intensity war across the Middle East, with relatively few casualties on the American side for what is gained from it, from that horrible cold-blooded point of view, making the U.S. military constantly improve itself. Now, has it learned any political lessons? Well, if the goal was actually to make the U.S. and the world safer, and these repeated failures of establishing regimes, then obviously it was a failure. But if that was only the rhetorical goal, and the goal was taking down governments that are not foreign policy aligned, that threaten U.S. control, where control is best, but chaos and instability are almost as good, a good plan B, a good fallback, then you could argue that actually the U.S. is achieving at some level exactly what it has desired across these regions.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. Bola, I wonder though, it can of course be argued that arms manufacturers, et cetera, are making a killing right now, of course, and have been for a number of years now, ever since these wars begun and have continued really into eternity. Do you though think that such polls, such as the one of Pew Research and others, I'm sure, which are showing that the general public is simply not going along with this, and even the military members, veterans, are not going along with this idea of constant warfare, is that going to be a challenge, or does that not even matter? Do you think the arms manufacturers will still be able to lobby themselves into further wars?
I think Mark has been able to articulate it properly and to show the relationship between the military-industrial complex and the political establishment in the U.S. and how that relationship oftentimes has pushed the U.S. into wars that are unnecessary and sometimes costly in terms of human lives. Certainly for those who are invaded. But what is more worrisome for me is also is the fact that when we itemize the cost of the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, we also lose sight of how destabilizing of the international order it has been. If you remember, post Cold War, Russia was one of the international actors that began to sort of manage its international its international behavior in a way that we were beginning to think that Russia was slowly integrating itself into the international society. But post 2005, we've seen Russia become more aggressive. In fact, the first evidence of that was in Georgia when it invaded Georgia, which was almost exactly the kind of rhetoric that the US used in Iraq. Almost in some sense, a replication of the kind of arguments that the US used in Iraq, humanitarian intervention and all sorts of things. And what I think that is important also to look at is when we're cataloging the effects and the consequences of US's actions in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We have to also look at not only the civilian casualties that have died in these wars, that are often times, as I said earlier, footnotes to history, but also the destabilization of the international order. And I think that it's in that last point, and I don't think that there is a sense in which the US has learned anything at all. You've mentioned about Iran, what's going on in Iran, and the willingness of the US to eschew all forms of common sense in its negotiation and its relationship with Iran. And I think that is very concerning for me.
Mohammed, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think, for example, what happened in your country, that the U.S. has learned the lessons, that anyone has really learned any lesson about what that invasion and, as you had put it as well, the resulting terrorism, etc. Do you think those lessons have been learned? Because, as Mark had said, a lot of people have made a lot of money from even the invasion just in Iraq. We know, of course, of many reports about a lot of corruption and about money that has just been lost and has not been accounted for.
Well, I would say yes. The way, for example, the way that the U.S. administration dealt with the Syrian crisis and the way it limited its intervention in Syrian crisis, it shows that many lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. But unfortunately, there are still a lot of officials and a lot of warlords. They are still looking to another war. They are still looking to another opportunity to make money. Usually, and everywhere, it's the case that so many people benefiting this kind of war and invasions, and so many lobbyist groups are working to get it done. While it's kind of conventional wisdom that this kind of war barely can achieve any political goals. If you look at the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, we see how the invasion just deteriorated, just exacerbated the political and security situations in the region. And we see how big and how heavy the cost of this invasion is for the people in these countries and even in the neighboring countries like Syria or like Pakistan or Iran and the other nearby countries.
Indeed.
I mean, there are always some people who are working and lobbying for one more invasion and one more war. While there are so many wise politicians and leaders, they believe that how the war and invasion would cost American people and American economy, and even for the local countries and the whole region, how the war would be
All right, Mohammed, we'll leave it there at that as our final word. That was a very good point to conclude on. We'll thank Mohammed, Bola, and Mark for their time and, of course, their insight. We've tried to get you a holistic view of this, viewers. It's important, of course. The fact is that military veterans and the American public are not on board with these wars that have already taken place and still continuing, really, it can be argued, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now any involvement in Syria and possibly any involvement for an escalation towards Iran, a further escalation, I should say. But yet, as Mark had put it, the military-industrial complex, the arms manufacturers would want more war because then that gives them, and soldiers really, more combat experience, which is something that is actually valued in militaries and for arms manufacturers to prove themselves and to prove their worth. But what about the human costs? What about the destabilization, I should say, of the region and of those countries which are attacked and interfered with? Does that even come into the equation at this time? A lot of questions, of course, remain unanswered. What will the next U.S. move be? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, this is an interesting and disturbing topic, really, about the relatives of people who were killed in one of those Boeing 737 MAX crashes. And this, I'm going to hold in on an example coming out of Indonesia. That crash, of course, occurred last year in Indonesia. Some families are claiming, and their lawyers are claiming, that they have been cheated out of proper compensation. For many of the family members who have spoken out to media, they say it's not necessarily just about the financial compensation and how much money they get out of this, but it's about making that point, about really getting accountability for what really occurred when it comes to these crashes to begin with. And the fact that Boeing, as a large corporation, as well as the airlines, be it Lion Air or others, we can hone in, of course, on the example of the other 737 crashes as well, be it in Ethiopia or otherwise, where the airlines and the airplane manufacturer are trying to get out of further litigation and are getting people and forcing people to sign documents which they would not want to sign if they fully understood what they were signing. To discuss all of that a bit further and put that into context for us is now Sanjiv Singh, who is a corporate and catastrophic injury litigator from the US, and he's one of the early attorneys to investigate and file in the Lion Air matter, together with Brian Kabatek and the Kabatek team. He currently represents both Lion Air and Ethiopian Air victim families. He's joining us now in the early morning there from San Francisco in California. Sanjiv, thanks for joining us here in Scope. Sanjiv, just put this into context for us. Why is this important? Boeing and even the lead insurer for both Lion Air and Boeing say that this is normal procedure. Is this normal?
No, it's absolutely not. And let me give you a comparison. Essentially, if there were to be an accident and the entity that caused the accident were to settle with the victims or the families of the victims, and there was an appropriate settlement that was reached, yes, it's true that in that case, signing of a settlement agreement where you would agree not to sue that entity in the future would be completely normal. It is not normal. It is completely coercive, and frankly, in my opinion, likely illegal for an entity to force families, coerce them, get them into rooms where they are asked to appear without counsel, and shown a document, or in some cases not even shown the document, only read the document, where that document prematurely signs away their rights to even sue or bring claims against the main culprit entities, including in this case, Boeing, and for that to happen in the wake of the crash. So to answer your question, absolutely not. This is an entirely different scenario. These families were asked to waive their rights to bring suits against entities like Boeing, whom we all know, who the world knows, was very likely responsible for both crashes, in order to receive a separate pot of money that was much smaller and statutorily owed to them, which was basically the insurance proceeds that they had a right to by law. This is very different.
As one of the family members, I believe, that spoke to the media said, Sanjiv, I forget her name right now, but I believe her husband, if I'm not mistaken, had been killed in that Lion Air crash, that is. She said it's not about the money. She's not looking to make money off of this, but she's trying to make a point, really, about accountability at this point. Is that really what's going on here, or is this about the money?
I think she hit the nail on the head, and you're actually talking about one of our clients who was interviewed, though frankly she speaks and is the voice for all of the victims. First and foremost, the notion that an entity like Boeing could escape lawsuit in the United States, where it should be answering any claims in connection with planes that it manufactured in the United States, the notion that they could escape the lawsuit is morally repulsive. And I think what she's alluding to is the fact that, imagine if your family member was obliterated on the Java Ocean due to the acts of a major US corporation. And suddenly, by virtue of you signing a paper giving you the right to receive a payment that has nothing to do with that you had a right to anyway, and you gave up the right to have that large defendant be accountable, that's morally outrageous. So I think she's right. It is not just about the money. But as it turns out, the difference between that statutory payout, which is to the tune of, frankly, 70 or 80,000 pounds, approximately, 200,000 US dollars, versus what these families should get paid for their own loss and pain and suffering, for the horrific terror that each and every one of the passengers experienced as the plane was obliterated on the Java Ocean, as it essentially nosedived into the ocean. It is, of course, about that difference as well.
Indeed. I imagine, Sanjiv, at some level that Boeing would say, listen, we announced on the 3rd of July, as you well know, Sanjiv, that they would provide $100 million to help communities and families affected by those two recent 737 MAX crashes. Is that enough?
I laugh at their gesture, and that's using a term diplomatically, of $100 million. I think it is suspiciously timed, frankly. I think that we've heard no details whatsoever as to where it is to be allocated. I am deeply concerned that it is timed in a manner that it was supposed to essentially confuse families, right on the eve of these families trying to negotiate settlements with Boeing. Yeah. And frankly, it brings to mind the saying, robbing Peter to pay Paul. I mean, on the one hand, you have a practice that involved these families signing releases, in most cases without counsel. The releases themselves are improper, and we see that Boeing is one of the principal beneficiaries of this release. And that release, the ultimate consequence is these families losing exponentially more money that they had a right to for the horror that they suffered. Yeah. And then Boeing now is coming out with what I view to be a Band-Aid. $100 million doesn't even come close when you think about the 187 people killed in the Lion Air crash. And that's not even to get to the passengers of the Ethiopian air crash who were also killed. So my view, I view the 100 million so-called pledge in the same way I view the releases, improper.
So Sanjiv, one of the reasons that I wanted to highlight this story, obviously it's disturbing, and there's a human angle, and it's important to realize that these are human beings whose lives were lost, of course, out of no fault, of course, of their own. But I'm wondering, when we're talking about corporations such as Boeing, or even airlines, really, such as Lion Air or others, there's always that accusation towards them that they prioritize business over even the lives that they may affect in an adverse fashion. And of course, when we're talking about an airline manufacturer, we're really talking about very sensitive territory, because these are human lives, and they're really trusting the airline to be able to do its job properly when it comes to having safety measures in place for a plane, et cetera, and to have tested over and over again. That clearly something went wrong with the 737 MAX. What for you? Why is this so important? Is this about holding a corporation to account? Is this about holding Boeing to account to ensure that in the future, God forbid, that this doesn't happen to anybody else?
It is first and foremost about ensuring that defendants of any kind, entities of any kind who manufacture equipment, planes, doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a plane, whether it's a car, where the operation of that equipment can potentially kill hundreds, if not thousands of people, that entity has to adhere to standards that are rigorous and that are extremely high. And what we know is that in the case of the development of the 737 MAX, it was known to Boeing that its plane had structural issues with oversized engines that had been moved, frankly, too far forward, causing the plane to have an inherent tendency to pitch upwards and an inherent tendency to therefore be at risk for stalling. Boeing then developed frankly, an inadequate solution in MCAS to try and address that.
Yeah.
And there were known problems with the operation of MCAS. So Boeing came nowhere close to the standards that it should have adhered to, and it should be held accountable.
Very well, Sanjiv, we'll leave there at that, but I appreciate your time very early in the morning there in San Francisco. Of course, an important topic there was Sanjiv Singh. They're speaking to us via Skype from California. Viewers, this 737 MAX crashes, of course, were all individually tragic. But it's also now, a case of holding Boeing, as well as these airlines, to account. But Boeing especially, because it sold these planes and is still, mind you, selling these planes after what it says have been tweaks to ensure safety. But it goes really to the heart of corporations themselves and how they react when it comes to if their products are deemed faulty. And in this case, for an airplane manufacturer's product to be deemed faulty, that results in the loss of innocent lives, as I said, through no fault of those people's own. So we'll keep a close eye on how all of this develops going forward and how these lawsuits play out in a court, be it in the US court or otherwise here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.